Driving down the interstate, running 30 minutes late, singing Margaritaville and minding my own. Some foreign car driving dude with a road rage attitude pulled up beside me talking on his cell phone. He started yelling at me like I did something wrong. He flipped me the bird and then he was gone. Some beach somewhere, there's a big umbrella casting shade over an empty chair. Palm trees are growing, a warm breeze is blowing. I picture myself right there on some beach somewhere. I circle the parking lot trying to find a spot just big enough I could park my old truck. A man with a big cigar was getting into his car. I stopped and I waited for him to back up. But from out of nowhere a Mercedes-Benz came cruising up and slipped right in. Some beach somewhere, there's a nowhere to go and you got all day to get there. There's cold margaritas and hot senoritas smiling with long dark hair on some beach somewhere. I sat in that waiting room, it felt like all afternoon. The nurse finally said, "Doc's ready for you. You're not gonna feel a thing, I'll give you some Novocaine. That tooth will be fine in a minute or two." But he stuck that needle down deep in my gums and he started drilling before I was numb. Some beach somewhere, well, there's a beautiful sunset burning up the atmosphere. There's music and dancing and lovers romancing the salty evening air on some beach somewhere. On some beach somewhere.
Welcome to Real Life. My name's Elijah Moody, and you are watching The Real. Tomorrow on Halloween, we are excited to be back in downtown Chelan handing out the biggest candy bars on the block. Come see us on the corner of Emerson and Wooden between 5 and 7 p.m. on October 31st. If you have a middle school boy or are a middle school boy, we want to make sure you're getting all the information on what's happening and when. So if you are not part of our Facebook group or getting texts from Remind, come see us after church at the connection table and we'll get you set up. If you're new to Real Life, please join our Real Life staff and connection team at Radiance Winery in Manson on Sunday, November 20th from 12 to 1:30 p.m. for a fun time of information and connection. Have a great Sunday. Once again, my name's Elijah Moody and you have been watching The Real.
Good morning, Real Life. How are we doing? Great. Doing good? Yeah, that's a good response. I'll take that. My name is Megan Johnson, and I am the pastor of growth and development here. And for those of you who don't know, the mission at Real Life is to help those who are far from God find real life in Christ. And so everything that you see on a Sunday, whether it's the songs that we're singing or the messages that we're teaching, are really done with them in mind. People who are feeling disconnected from God, maybe they've never felt like they could connect with God, or maybe they're just investigating and asking a lot of questions about what is faith and what does that actually look like in real life. And then another part of our real life family are people who have been at this for a long time. They're people who have tasted that real life in Christ, and they've been committed to being a part of this community to also help you find that as well. So I love our church for that reason, is we are a big blend of people that are all across the board in our faith journeys that are just trying to support one another and figuring out what it looks like to actually have a real life that Christ is involved in. So, we're so glad that you're here. Thank you for being here with us. One announcement, they did mention in the reel that tomorrow night, Halloween, I don't know if you saw some of the cute kids walking in the hallways. My son was a man that was the invisible man. He put his jacket on backwards and put sunglasses on because he forgot his costume, so I was leading him down the hallway. But all your other kids looked prepared and very cute, not mine. But anyway, tomorrow night, we're going to be downtown Chelan at the corner of Wooden and Johnson, right? Wooden and Emerson, handing out full-size candy bars. So you might want to get there a little bit on the early side. They're going to be there from 5 to 7 because I think that's going to be probably a really popular spot to be. So make sure that your kids get there. I'm going to open us in prayer, and then we're going to continue worshiping together as a family. Dear Lord, I thank you so much for Sundays. I thank you that we get to gather. I thank you for the privilege of coming together, no matter where we're at, what we're wrestling with today, what we're thinking through, what's stressing us out. Lord, I just pray that today, as we're here, just waiting on you, that you will just make yourself so evident in those areas that we need to hear from you today. Will you make yourself incredibly real to us? In Jesus' name, amen. Please stand and sing.
When all I see is the battle, you see my victory. When all I see is a mountain, you see a mountain move. And as I walk through the shadows, your love surrounds me. There's nothing to fear now, for I am safe with you. So when I fight, I'll fight on my knees with my hands lifted high. Oh God, the battle belongs to you, and every fear I lay at your feet. I'll sing through the night. Oh God, the battle belongs to you. And if you are for me, who can be against me? For Jesus, there's nothing impossible. When all I see is the ashes, you see the beauty. Oh. When all I see is a cross, you see the empty tomb. So when I fight, I'll fight on my knees with my hands lifted high. Oh God, the battle belongs to you, and every fear I lay at your feet. I'll sing through the night. Oh God, the battle belongs to you. Almighty fortress, you go before us. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. You shine in the shadows, you win every battle. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. You go before us. Yes. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. You shine in the shadows. You win every battle. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. Almighty fortress, you go before us. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. You shine in the shadows. You win every battle. Nothing can stand against the power of our God. So when I I'll fight on my knees with my hands lifted high. Oh God, the battle belongs to you. Every fear I lay at your feet. I'll sing through the night. Oh God, the battle belongs to you. Oh God, the battle belongs to you.
I have this hope as an anchor for my soul through every storm. I will hold to you with endless love. All my fear is swept away in everything. I will trust in you. There is hope in the promise of the cross. You gave everything to save the world you love. And this hope is an anchor for my soul. Our God will stand unshakable. Unchanging one, he who was and is to come. Your promise true, you will not let go. There is hope in the promise of the cross. You gave everything to save the world you love. And this hope is an anchor for my soul. Our God will stand unshakable. Your name is higher, your name is greater. All my hope is in you. Your word unfailing, your promise unshaken. All my hope is in you. Your name is higher, your name is greater. unfailing, your promise unshaken. All my hope is in you. Your name is higher, your name is greater. All my hope is in you. Your word unfailing, your promise unshaken. All my hope is in you. There is hope in the promise of the cross. You gave everything to save the world you love. And this hope is an anchor for my soul. Our God will stand unshakable. You may be seated. There's a jersey on the wall in high school gym in my hometown. In the corner by the scoreboard where the bleacher seats fold down. 27 took the Tigers to the finals that year. But that's not why it's hanging there. And if I ever get to heaven, you're not a long list of questions like how do you make a snowflake? Are you angry when the earth quakes? How does the sky change in a minute? How do you keep this big rock spinning? Why can't you stop a car from crashing? Forgive me, I'm just asking. I bet somewhere there's a yearbook in a box under a bed with a senior picture missing, a loving memory instead. And somewhere there's a mother who stopped going to church 'cause your plan quit making sense down here on earth. And if I ever get to heaven, you know I got a long list of questions like how do you make a snowflake? Are you angry when the earth quakes? How does the sky change in a minute? How do you keep this big rock spinning? Why can't you stop a car from crashing? Forgive me, I'm just asking. Oh, I'm just saying. You don't have to answer now, but someday, if I ever get to heaven, I got a long list of questions like how do you make a snowflake? Are you angry when the earth quakes? How does the sky change in a minute? How do you keep this big rock spinning? If you've got your hands on everything that happens, then why couldn't you stop that car from crashing? Forgive me, I'm just asking. I'm just asking.
Good morning. My name is Graham. I work here at Real Life with Megan, and I wear a lot of hats here at Real Life. My favorite part of my job, hands down, is youth ministry. I get to be a youth pastor. It's really the best job in the world. It really is, because you get to act like a child, you get to eat like a child, but you get to talk about the most important stuff in the entire world. Like, it's fantastic. In the last couple weeks, actually, I got to do this pretty cool thing with a couple of our small groups. I went to 2 different middle school small groups, and at one of them, they were just asking me questions, and another one, I was kind of fielding some different thoughts on where they were in their faith and stuff like that. And this question that we're going to talk about today actually came up in both of those conversations. I mean, and it's a big question. It's a simple question, but it's a big question. And here I'm thinking, I've got these middle schoolers asking these fantastic questions. I'm the greatest youth pastor in the world. Look at me. They're here, they're engaged, they're asking the biggest theological questions, important questions. I'm like, this is it. I'm killing it. Like, I've got this down. I'm about ready to go into Kyle's office and bust down and ask for a raise. I mean, I'm ready for this. And then the same thing happened in both conversations, all right? Both conversations, these are separate instances, took place a week apart with 2 different groups. One was with girls, one was with boys. And while they both asked me really good questions, somehow the topic of baptizing dogs came up. You girls know, because you were there. They wanted to know, I'm serious, they didn't know about each other's conversations, and they're talking about, do dogs need to be baptized? And that's when I started filling out my resume, because I'm like, I might need to look for a new career. I don't know that I'm doing this too well. Especially because the kids should know, my generation knows, right? All dogs go to heaven, right? They don't need to be baptized. But I have failed. Anyways, we are in a sermon series today, and I'm going to get to wrap that up for us, that we're calling Simple. And we're talking about how at one point we got a simple faith, right? We were given the complex principles of the Bible, and they were given those to us as a child, and they were simple because we're children. And for a lot of us, that faith never matured. So when life happened and life got challenging, those simple answers that we got as children, they don't add up anymore. They don't work for us. So today we're going to look at that question, that first question that I got to talk with some middle schoolers about, and it's by far the number one question I get asked as a pastor. It's by far the number one question that causes people to walk away from faith. It's by far one of the most simple questions that I don't think deserves a simple answer. And it's, why do bad things happen to good people? Why is that? Why do bad things happen to good people? And better yet, why is it possible that we have a good God who's all-powerful, and yet bad things happen? In fact, bad things happen to his followers. Bad things happen to his disciples, the people who literally hung out with him. Why does that happen? For some of us, this has really caused us to take a step back from God. For some of us, it's caused us to take a huge step back. Maybe we're still here, we're still like kind of in. There's things about Jesus or God that we like. There's things about church that we like, but we have like one foot in and one foot out because we can't reconcile this. We have this inability to reconcile a good and loving God with a world that's full of pain and suffering. Those two things just can't blend together inside of us, and so it's caused us to either step out of church completely, and maybe you're somebody who is watching online right now, or somebody sent you this later on because you're like, I'm not into church, I'm not doing this thing. Or maybe you are here, maybe you've just said, hey, I'm just not going to dive fully in because I can't reconcile these two things together. And as I said, it's a simple question, but I don't think it deserves a simple answer. Simple answers don't hold up to complex emotions. In this, when we talk about pain and suffering, hurt, injustice, when we talk about that kind of stuff, we have a lot of emotions that well up in us, as we should. as we should. And a simple answer isn't going to hold up when we have complex emotions, when we're talking about stuff like death and cancer, when we're talking about divorce and bankruptcy and the really hard stuff. You know, the really, really hard stuff. I heard a story a while ago of somebody that was, they came to tell me about how Satan was attacking them because they had ordered 2 Christian books off Amazon and their shipping was delayed. And I was like, yes, wow, the devil is after you. Like, look at that. That's not what we're talking about today. We're talking about the really hard stuff. The stuff that we just prayed would never happen. The stuff that we wish God could take away. That's what we're talking about today. Here's how this usually breaks down in our mind. We think of this good and just God who's all-powerful. So we look at it like this. We say, if he's good, he would. Or if he could, he would, right? If he's good, he should take care of these things. If he could, he would take care of all these things. But obviously, since he doesn't take care of them, then he's either not good, which doesn't sound like a very fun God to pursue, or he can't, and therefore he's not all-powerful, which means he's not even God. How is it possible that Christians for thousands of years could believe in this God that allows bad and evil things to happen? How do they do that? Kind of the basic argument, we're going to kind of get a little tangent here. The basic argument that a Christian could make for God is that everything exists, right? I exist, you exist, this world, however big, universe, it exists, right? Things exist. We know that. And something has to create that. It wasn't just always here. There was some creator. Because something exists, something created it, and that thing that created it is above it, right? It's greater than it. A word that we don't use very often in English is the word supra. Supra means above. So whatever created nature is supra-nature. It's above nature. This is where we get the phrase supernatural. And then 2,000 years ago, this guy shows up in the Middle East and he starts doing supernatural things. We have this historically documented that this guy is doing supernatural things, and this is why Christians say, well, there must be a God. There must be a God, and he kind of claimed to be all good and powerful, but how is it possible? How is it possible that this is real and yet I don't feel like it should be? Or sometimes when we're looking pain and suffering in the face, and we're like, how is it possible that there is a good God out there? Now, here's what I'm willing to bet. I'm willing to bet that there's a good number of you in here who have wrestled with this, and as I said, maybe taken a step back from Christianity a little bit. And guess what? I mean this, I'm going to sound like a smart aleck because I'm usually a smart aleck, but I mean this 100% seriously. If you have struggled with the evil and injustice in this world, and you have taken a step back a little bit, good for you. I really mean that. It means that you're a thinking person, right? You're taking this faith stuff seriously, and good for you. I'm also willing to bet, if you're a thinking person, that you went out and you looked for those answers somewhere else, right? You went to Google, you went to your science professor, whatever it might have been, and I'm willing to bet you didn't find an answer there. I'm willing to bet that because you're listening to me right now, right? The answer you got out there didn't suffice, so you're still looking for the answer. Maybe this too, this has happened to me also. Have you ever run into somebody that has experienced extreme pain and injustice in their life? Somebody, I mean, like really has been through the hard stuff. The stuff that I hear stories. It's one of the cool parts of my job is getting to walk through life with people. And I hear stories that are so gut-wrenching, so painful. And I think, oh my gosh, how in the world can anybody survive going through something like that? And then you run into people who've been through that kind of injustice, and they have this extraordinary faith, right? Sometimes this extreme injustice leads to extraordinary confidence in God. You ever run into somebody like that? Man, that'll mess you up. It's like, what in the world? What do they know that I don't know? What is going on there? Like, how do they have that kind of faith that I don't have? So, I want to give a couple little warnings, and then we're going to jump in. If you are somebody who maybe has really struggled with faith because of this, maybe you've even argued against God because of the idea of evil and injustice in the world, I just want to give you 3 little warnings, then bam, we're going to jump right in, okay? Here's the first one. Where's the first one? Sometimes, I'm not talking to everybody here, but I'm going to talk to a few people. Sometimes, it's so much easier to point our blame at other places and other people than it is to accept our own fault. Again, this is not a blanket statement. It doesn't cover every situation. But sometimes we blame God for hurt and pain in our life that we've actually brought into our lives. Or sometimes somebody else brought it into our life, and we blame God for that. Again, I'm not saying that's everyone. When I sit down and I talk to people and they tell me their stories, which, by the way, I'm a terrible counselor. I'm really good at pointing people in the right direction, like, oh, you should go here, you should talk to them. But I'm not patient. I'm really opinionated. I like to hear myself talk. I'm really blunt, too. If you're looking for that, come on over, right? But other than that, it's just not me. It's just not my thing. And sometimes when people want to sit down and they tell me their story and they say, why would God do this to me? And I think, I don't know that God had anything to do with that, right? I don't know that God instituted your bankruptcy. I think maybe the $7 latte in your hand and that car payment right out there probably helped out a little bit, right? But that's just me. Again, I don't think that's everybody's situation, but I think sometimes, myself included, we point the blame at God when really it wasn't his fault. Another one, point 2, is that we have pursued a life without God before. Sometimes it's just easy to say, this isn't working, there's injustice all over, there's evil, let's just get rid of God. And guess what? Those of us who are a little older or maybe have studied a little bit of history know that doesn't pan out well. Like, do a little research, check out the Enlightenment. Like, it doesn't work well, okay? And the last one is this. If you've ever leveraged this argument that there must not be a God because there's pain and evil in the world, and you have taken somebody's story and said, look at what happened to them. Look at what happened. I can't believe that there's a God out there that would allow this to happen. You have got to be careful using somebody else's pain and suffering for your own argument. You can't commandeer somebody else's pain to make your point. And I know this because I have talked to so many people who would say that that pain, that suffering brought them closer to God. And therefore, it's not fair for us to take that from them. Now listen, I know it can be an emotional argument. I know that it can hurt to talk about this stuff. But there's no rational argument against the existence of God based on injustice. There's no rational argument, okay? There's an emotional argument by far, but it's not necessarily a rational argument, okay? There's a difference. If you've never or you don't get to experience high emotional arguments with low rationality, I invite you to come to my house. They happen regularly. Right now, my 2.5-year-old Daly, she is the queen of these arguments. She's figured out that there are certain excuses and reasons that she can use to get out of doing something we tell her to do or to try to get what she wants. So she has like this little bucket of reasons, and she'll pull one out and she'll use it when we ask her to do something. The problem is she's 2.5, and the reason she pulls out doesn't usually fit what we're asking her to do. So we're sitting at dinner and she's not eating her dinner, and we're like, Daly, like, you need to eat your dinner before you can get all down. She wants to be done. We're like, no, you need to eat your dinner before you get on. She says, I can't. We says, why you can't? And she says, because I sleeping. Like, you're sleeping. Fantastic. Can't argue, and she has narcolepsy. This is great. Right? She's sleeping. Another time, she's whining because everybody else gets a cookie. She doesn't get a cookie. Sorry, Dede, you don't get a cookie. You didn't eat your dinner because you were sleeping, okay? So you don't get a cookie. Everybody else gets a cookie. And she said, I need a cookie. I'm sick. I was like, okay. Our favorite one that we throw around all the time in our house now is we're telling all the kids, you got to clean up, you got to clean up. We're like, Daly, you need to help clean up. You need to go get your toys. You need to help clean up. She says, I tent. And she gets down on all fours. She says, I a puppy. Listen, I'm telling you, especially when it comes to a cookie, high emotion, low rationality. All right? And this is the same way. I mean, this is a lot more serious, but this is the same way. There's no rational argument against the existence of God based on the injustice of the world. And to make it even more clear, Christians have never made the argument for God's existence based on a world where bad things never happen to good people. Christians have never made this argument, and if you've heard it from somebody or you heard it from a stage, from a church, I apologize. Right? This was never, it's not in the Bible, this was never an argument for Christians. In fact, Christians argued the opposite because Jesus said the opposite. In the book of John, which was written by Jesus' probably his best friend, Jesus says this, in this world you will have tribulation. In this world you will have tribulation. Now we don't use the word tribulation all that much, so a lot of our translations will break it into one of two words. Sometimes it'll say troubles, or you will have suffering, right? But tribulation is kind of a combo of those two things. In this world you have tribulation. Again, not a word we use very much, although I'm thinking it perfectly describes my fantasy football team this year, so I'm going to have to switch my name up a little bit. In this world, Jesus says, you're going to have troubles. You're going to have suffering. Therefore, Christians have never argued that that won't happen. So if anything, because there's no rational argument against the existence of God, if anything, the pain and suffering in this world calls into question God's justice, not his existence. Right? He's here, but it kind of feels like he's not doing anything about it. It doesn't argue against that he exists. It's kind of like if you were to talk to one of my kids, probably my oldest would be the best, my son. He is the most rational and the less emotional. And you saw him and you maybe asked him, hey, how are things going, buddy? And he says, oh, they're going good. I'm playing soccer and yada, yada. And my mom's the best homeschool teacher in the whole world and yada, yada. And you say, well, how are things at home? Are they treating you okay? And then he might tell you, you know what? It's not going too well. And they say, well, what's going on? And he says, my son might say, my dad's a loser. Like he gets on the stage and he thinks he's the funny guy and yada, yada, and he goes to youth group and he eats pizza with teenagers, but when he comes home, he's a terrible dad. He might say that. Say, he's a terrible dad. He doesn't spend time with us. He's so worried about his fantasy football team all the time, and they're in complete tribulation, and he might tell you all these terrible things about how I'm a terrible parent, but our argument would not be to look at him and say, oh, sweetheart, you don't have a daddy, right? He'd say, yes, I do. He's just a loser. Were you not listening to me? Right? The argument that God is not justful or not coming through the way we think that he should isn't an argument that says he doesn't exist. It's an argument against his justice. If he would, he could. So maybe he can't, or maybe he won't. This is one reason why I think it makes more sense to be angry with God sometimes than to act like he doesn't exist. And there's a book in the Bible called Psalms. It's in the Old Testament. It starts with a P. It's called Psalms, and a lot of it is poetry. And there's some certain Psalms in there that are really just like angry towards God. And it's David writing most of these, and he's angry with God. And sometimes these are my favorite Psalms to read. Because David doesn't doubt in there that God existed. He's just mad at him. He's like, what are you doing up there, God? Like, this isn't going too well for me down here. You said you were going to protect me. You said you were going to bless me. My enemies are all over. What is going on right now? There's no rational argument for the existence of God based off of the injustice. So where do we get this? Where do we get this idea that if there is a God, he must be good and just, right? Maybe we got it from like old religion, something like maybe it came out of Egypt or the pharaohs, because Judaism was started around the time of the pharaohs and stuff like that. Maybe they pulled that out of that, but the reality is, like, Egyptian pharaohs, they didn't believe in gods who were good and just. They didn't even believe in gods who liked their followers. Maybe it came from, like, the Greeks. The Greeks had a lot of gods. Maybe Julius Caesar and the Greeks, like, maybe they did it, but that doesn't seem to be true. They didn't have any gods who were good and just. What about the Roman gods? Because that's like Jesus was born in the Roman Empire, so maybe there's some Roman gods that Jesus and the other Christians would have pulled from. But again, there's no good and just gods in the Roman world. So where do we get this from? Where do we get this idea? My guess is that somebody probably told us. Right? And where did that person get that idea? They get it from nature? They get it from biology class? Nope. Nature's not good and just. Right? Nature doesn't know anything about dignity. When you look at natural selection and stuff like that, there's nothing in there about grace and mercy and dignity. Right? You ever had a cat? Might be some kids watching, so I'm going to be careful. Have you ever had a cat run away from home? You know what I'm saying? They ran off, to a better life, to maybe an upstate farm or something. Right? That's not justice. That's natural selection. Right? That's nature. That's biology. Natural selection, nature, biology, they know nothing about dignity. So where do we get this? Where do we get this idea? And better yet, maybe did we walk away too soon? Maybe for some of us who are kind of 1 foot in and 1 foot out, did we maybe get off the boat too early? Or throw in the towel before it was done? Maybe we cut to the credits before the movie was over. Because why is it that other people can stick with it? Why is it that other people use these things to grow their faith? And for some of us, it just doesn't feel right. Maybe for some of us, we stepped away a little too early. When I look at history, and I really like history now, I wish I would have liked history, like 20 years ago, 25 years ago when I was in school and getting graded on it. That would have been great. But no, I like history now. And we don't find this idea of justice and dignity and fairness for all, we don't find this anywhere in history until this Jesus character shows up, right? The justice and dignity for all version of God, that was introduced by Jesus. That's just a historical fact. Whether you're a Christian or you're a believer, you have faith in this God or not. History-wise, we don't find any other religion or any other group of people that believed in justice and dignity for all versions of God. I got on a little kick for a while, and I wanted to find, was there even a culture beforehand that viewed women as equally, as equal to men? Was there even a single culture? And the answer is no. We don't find one. The Spartans got kind of close a little bit, but the reason why a Spartan woman was elevated was because she could have babies, and preferably warriors. But it's like they got closer than other people, but there's not even one. There's no religion or culture that believed in justice and dignity for everybody until Jesus came. There's nobody that said it doesn't matter what gender they are, it doesn't matter what age they are, it doesn't matter what color their skin is or how much money they make, if they're free or a slave. There wasn't a single religion or culture out there until Jesus came, and he introduced this. And maybe for some of us, we see that and we're like, well, how come my story's not getting justice and dignity? How come my story didn't get redeemed? Right? There's this guy, we looked at another thing he had written earlier, but this guy, John, who hung out with Jesus for 3 years and really was probably his best friend, wrote a bunch of the Bible, and he wrote a bunch of it while he was sitting in prison, like this island prison, right? You can think of Alcatraz. And he's just going to be left there to rot, all right? And he's writing the Bible. He doesn't know it's the Bible at the time. He's writing letters, and he writes this verse that you've probably heard before, even whether you've gone to church or not. He writes, God so loved the, and then I feel like he probably paused. And he's like thinking, like, what is the right word? And maybe he's getting inspiration from the Holy Spirit or something, and he's like, God so loved the Jews, right? We know God so loved the Jews. We got a whole book about it. And he's like, nah, that's not right, eraser. However they would erase. I don't know. Do quills come with erasers? I don't know how that works. He's like, no, God so loved his followers, right? God so loved his followers, right? Because those are the people who are honoring to him. And then he's like, no. And he's thinking back to his 3 years with Jesus, and he's thinking, what's the right word to put here? What did God so love? And then he writes the world, which would have just been crazy. God so loved the world. I guarantee even the people who read these letters that he wrote were like, God so loved the what? Like, no, that must be a mistake. You know what? He must not have an eraser on the end of his quill. Like, he must have did that, and it was a mistake. Because God so loved the world, like, how is that even possible? You mean God so loves women and children? And remember that group of people over there that took us captive for 400 years? God so loves them too? And God so loves, like, the Romans that are persecuting us right now? It's like, nah, John, you must have wrote this wrong. But John knew something. John knew after those 3 years that this was different. This was unlike any religion or culture that had ever existed before. And God was going to provide justice and dignity for absolutely everyone. How is it possible that he could have that kind of faith? How is it possible that John, after watching Jesus get crucified, could have that kind of faith that Jesus was going to take care of everything? How's that possible? It's kind of like what I said earlier when you run into people who have those stories. Like, how is it possible that you were talking to her after her 3rd miscarriage and she still has faith? How is it possible that you were talking to him after finding out that he doesn't actually get to retire this year? He's got to put in another 5 years, and he still has faith. How is it possible that they found out that the cancer was back, and yet they still have faith? It makes me feel like they know something that we don't know. How is it possible that these Christians during this time were being martyred, which means they were being murdered for their beliefs? Christians were being marched into the Roman Colosseum, and this was like halftime entertainment, and they would release lions to just destroy these Christians, right? And while that's happening, these Christians are singing songs about a good and loving God. How in the world is that possible? How is it possible that they can sing words that were inspired by John when he wrote, "Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love." How can they sing songs about a God who loves everyone while they're being killed? While they're being killed for their own beliefs? Love and loving everybody, that was new. That was birthed by Jesus. Really, there's no reason why that belief system should have ever made it out of the 1st century. In fact, the Roman Empire was doing everything to squash it and put it away. And yet somehow, it grew and grew and grew, and eventually became the official religion of the Roman Empire. As we said, it's not natural. loving people who don't love you, loving people who persecute you, loving people who are different than you, that's not natural. That's not what biology tells us to do. I think that's why there's this inclination when we hear about injustice in the world, there's this strong push to just rid the world of it. It's so much easier, right, to just get rid of right and wrong. We look at these terrible things that happen. I was reading the news this morning. You can read the news any day of the week and find terrible things that happen. Over 150 people were killed in South Korea in the last couple of days. It was a stampede. They were crushed. Almost all of them were younger than me, and I'm 23, so you can figure out. No, I'm sorry, I'm 24. How is it possible that terrible things can happen like that? And there be a good and just God, and people still believe in that God. It's so much easier just to say, those are terrible things. There's no way that a God who's all-powerful and all-loving would have anything to do with this, therefore, he must not be here. But the problem is when we rid ourselves of any kind of standard of justice, we also rid ourselves of injustice as well. When we get rid of some kind of standard, when we take God and we say, you know what, you're not real because bad things are happening, I'm going to put you up on the shelf up here. I'll let you know when you get to come play again, all right? And we walk away. We also lose the justice and dignity for all God. We also lose the one person who says everybody has inherent value. We don't get to just take part of that and leave the other part on the shelf. We put the whole thing up there. And then we're left with my justice and your justice and power justice and rich justice and clan justice and ISIS justice. We're left with whatever I think is right and whatever you think is right. And as our culture becomes more and more post-Christian, as we become kind of just more, hey, I live my truth and you live your truth, we just continue to become more and more fractured. And the further we get away, the louder we have to yell. And now it just seems like everybody's yelling. You live your truth, I'll live my truth, and if we don't agree, we'll take this up like men and we'll fight on Twitter. When we reject God because of the injustice in the world, we don't solve the problem of injustice. That's the other problem too. If we put God on the shelf, if we put him up there, not only do we lose the dignity and justice for all God, but now we're just left with a world full of injustice and no help. We don't get to eat our cake and have it too. So here's a good question. What does the Bible even have to say about this stuff? Right? If this is such a good question, doesn't the Bible say something? Shouldn't Jesus have addressed this a little bit besides the fact that you're going to have some tribulation in your life? Like, thanks for that, Jesus. Can I have a little advice or something? And the answer is yes, Jesus does talk about it. We don't love the answer, but he does talk about it. He tells this story. He would tell these parables, which are stories meant to teach. And he tells this parable about a woman who's trying to get justice. And the way you would get justice then is you would bring your case to a judge, they would usually hang out like in the center square or sometimes at the front of the city gates. And you would go them and you would ask for them to see your case, and they would be known as a fair and just person, and they would oversee whatever happened. You would bring your evidence, the other party would bring your evidence. That's how it worked back then. The problem is if you didn't have a lot of money or you didn't know the right person, you didn't get to be in the front of the line. And so your case might get pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. So we hear the story about a woman who's trying to plead her case, which at this time in the world, we can probably assume that she was a widow. Otherwise, a man probably would have represented her case. That's just how things were back then. But she can't get anybody. So she decides to take matters into her own hand, and she starts stalking this judge. She's everywhere. She shows up at work. She shows up at his house. He takes his wife out on a date. She shows up there, right? She's sliding into his DMs, whatever that means, right? She's getting after him every way possible. And finally, he's like, I've had enough. I've had enough. Okay, I'll see your case. I'll see your case. And Jesus tells that story, and then he says this. He says, and will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice and quickly. Well, that sounds great. I see that they will get justice and quickly. Fantastic. And then he says, however, which whenever it says however in the Bible, or sometimes they'll say therefore, you got to listen up. All right? It's kind of like this. Okay, you boys in the front row, this is for you, okay? When you ask a girl out, okay, and you say, hey, would you like to go out with me, or whatever it is you kids do, right? It's probably over text, okay? And she says, yeah, I'll go out with you. And then she says, however, okay? You better listen up, all right? Because whatever she says after that is way more important, right? However, you got to talk to my dad first. And then you're like, never mind, all right? Right? However is always very important when you're reading the Bible, okay? However, he says, when the Son of Man comes, and the Son of Man was a nickname that he had given himself. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? He says, yeah, you're going to get justice. I promise that when I show up, you're going to get justice, and it's going to come quick. But until then, are you going to have faith? When I come back, are you going to be one of the people who can look and say, yeah, it doesn't matter what the test results were. It doesn't matter what the number is in the bank account. Are you going to be one of those people that still has faith? Jesus says, yeah, you're going to get justice, just not yet. And I don't know about you, but that's uncomfortable. I don't like that very much. It kind of reminds me right now when you go to buy gas, right? And right now I've tricked myself that I only fill up my truck halfway because somehow I'm like, yeah, that's working, right? You're not using as much gas because it's so expensive, right? It's uncomfortable, and it's the truth when my credit card statement shows up and it's like, oh yeah, gas is expensive. Right? Something can be very uncomfortable and truthful at the same time, all right? For my lady friends out there, you've got a pair of jeans that you look fantastic in, right? I mean, they just do it, but they are not comfortable, right? You get home and immediately it's yoga pants, right? It's the truth. You look good in them, but it is uncomfortable, right? Next time, you're going to say, that was the stupidest analogy. But the next time you put those pants on, you're going to look in the mirror and you're going to say, that's the truth right there. There are things in our lives that are uncomfortable, but they are still true. It is possible that we can live in a world with evil and pain and injustice, and there can still be a good, loving God who will eventually come back and make all things right. That is absolutely possible. Uncomfortable? Yes. Truthful? Yes. And if anybody should have got this, shouldn't it have been Jesus? If anybody should say, hey, this doesn't really make a lot of sense, shouldn't it be the guy who got nailed to the cross? I mean, they had to go and find witnesses. They had to pay false witnesses to come in and say, yeah, Jesus said this and Jesus said that and yada, yada. They made up all these lies so that they could get Jesus put on trial. And then they used peer pressure in order to get him killed. Jesus was murdered. I mean, in any way that you read it, Jesus was murdered. He's the only guy that we believe as Christians was sinless. And we have no historical evidence that he ever broke the law in any way, and yet he was murdered. So would anybody have a right to say, excuse me, God, this isn't working for me? This kind of injustice, this kind of good, all loving God, where are you at right now while I'm getting nailed to the cross? If anybody should be able to look back and say, that's not right, it would be Jesus. Unless Jesus knew something that we didn't. And I got to be honest, when I think about Jesus on the cross and when I think about those terrible things happening to him, and I also think about people that I've sat down with who are going through the worst of the worst, and they're like still have this extreme, extraordinary, amazing faith. And I'm like, how in the world do you do this? There's kind of this like glimmer in their eyes a little bit when it comes to speaking about their hope. They just know something. They see something that the rest of us can't see. And I think it's that they see the end and they know that God plays the long game. You will have justice. And your justice will come quickly, but just not yet. And as uncomfortable as that can be, it is the truth. What's interesting is that when God says, hey, I'm going to bring justice, you would think the one who would come would be a judge. But it wasn't. He sent a Savior. And when we reject this, when we reject the idea that there's a good and loving God out there, even though it doesn't feel that way, it doesn't make it any easier for us. For some of us, really for some people who sit in that category of having this extreme faith, the presence of evil in the world, the things that they're going through, to them is not evidence that God doesn't exist. It reminds them of how much we need God, how much we need mercy, of how much we need grace. The evil and injustice in this world can be nagging reminders that something is wrong. And don't you just feel that? Like when you read a story about 150 kids who are probably in their teens and 20s getting trampled to death in South Korea, when you read about those things, you just want it to be made right. It's just not the way it's supposed to be, and we know that deep down inside of us. In fact, we long for a justice which isn't even possible, right? I long, as a parent, I long for the parents who had to go and identify their children. I long for them to have their kids back, and I know that's not even possible. And the author C.S. Lewis has this great line when it comes to feelings like that, and he says, if I find myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. You and I are reminded of this every day. We're reminded of what could be and what should be. Jesus said someday will be. And it's not easy, and it's usually uncomfortable, but it is simple. In your bulletins, there's these handouts, there's these little blue cards that we put in there. It's also on our app if you're like tech savvy or you didn't grab one on your way in. And we have these little next steps because we think it's fantastic that you would come and hang out with us, that you would listen online, right? We think that that's fantastic, but we kind of want to take it another step. We don't just want to sit and soak. We want to change. We want to be better. So in our next steps today, number one, stop trying to find reasons not to believe in God. I sympathize with you for the hurt and pain that you've been through. Again, I've heard some of your stories, and it's absolutely terrible what has been done to you and what you've gone through. But maybe you got off the boat too soon. Maybe you asked for the check early. Maybe the God of justice and dignity is still waiting. He's still sitting on the shelf saying, hey, I want to be a part of your life. Hey, I want to help you through this. But when we look for all the reasons not to believe in God, we'll find them. We'll find them. Maybe today's your day where you just stop that. Just say, you know what, I'm going to stop trying to find reasons not to believe in God. You're not fully committing. You're not getting baptized next week or anything. But you're saying, I'm going to just stop trying to find reasons not to believe in God. Second one, stop blaming God for the injustice in this world. Now, again, this is a very specific group of people, but I do come across this, and I think it's worth mentioning, that some of the hurt and pain in our life was caused by other people. Some of the hurt and pain in our lives was caused by us. We made poor decisions. We had bad judgment, or maybe we took some bad advice, or maybe somebody else was just rotten and treated us poorly. And God sits there and he sympathizes with you and says, that's not right. You should have never been treated that way. Now, you can continue to blame God because I think God can take it. He can handle it. But I think maybe you're missing something. Maybe missing out on an awesome relationship with him because of it. Lastly, embrace the faith that God is playing the long game. Again, this is not easy. And this is something that is so inspiring when I see other people who have figured this out. When we feel like our needs, our desires, our even comfort needs to be taken care of right now, and somebody else who's in a way worse situation says, no, not yet. It's not yet. But God plays the long game. And I promise you that one day he's going to come back and he's going to make everything right. And that's not like a general statement like, hey, everything will be cool. It'll be like Disneyland. No, he's going to come back and he's going to make everything right in your life specifically. Like he thinks of you and he's like, I'm going to take care of those things. But will he find faith when he comes back? Because he's playing the long game. Will you pray with me? Father, I thank you so much for my friends here. Thank you for my friends up in Brewster as well. God, I just thank you so much for just your words, even when they're hard to read, when they're hard to understand, when maybe they don't feel right or they don't sit well with us. God, I just thank you that we have you to turn to. I thank you that we have your scripture to read. And I ask for all that in the powerful name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Hey, if you're still listening up in Brewster, because I didn't turn it over to Billy in time, thank you guys for hanging out with us. If you're here in the room with me, thank you guys. We'll see you next week. We're starting a brand new series.